Hello, strangers. Don't touch that dial. You've tuned into Neon Static, where once a week, your host, Viola, that's me, brings you a spooky, unsettling story you won't hear anywhere else. Like and subscribe if that's your vibe. Now let me ask you, have you ever been in a situation that seems perfect? The perfect job, the perfect vacation spot, that perfect man. But there's something a little off about it. You feel crazy because everything looks right to you, but you just can't let go of that one feeling that something isn't right. You've asked your friends, but what if it's someone you don't know who gives the best advice? Someone you've never seen before, and when it's all over, you'll never see again, leaving your original question answered, but so many more in their wake. Buckle up. We're taking a drive through the fog for this one, in story 182. And here's what happened. I did bottle service for a while. I'm not ashamed of it, but you can imagine how describing a job with a weight and looks requirement, when you're paid to flirt and accommodate high-paying customers in VIP sections, well, how that could look. I've got a ton of stories from that time, unfortunately, but it was during that job that I met someone that kicked off what would be one of the most insane things that ever happened to me in my whole life. He was one of the high rollers' friends. In our line of work, we got very used to scanning everyone at the tables. We were always on the lookout for rowdiness, signs that someone might take VIP a little too seriously and feel entitled to more than a friendly smile served with their bottles. This guy, who I'm calling Winston, well, he didn't flag on my radar as trouble at all. He was quiet and polite. He didn't take shots, and instead he steadily sipped his drinks throughout the night. I did catch his eyes on me. Light blue, even in the murky club lighting, they were light enough I could see exactly where and what he was looking at. And as the night went on, he was looking at me. And I looked back, because he was pretty attractive. I wondered if he was going to approach, hit on me, but he didn't. I appreciated that. I'll admit it piqued my interest more than if he had. But at the end of the night, when his high roller friend finally called it quits and rallied his table for the next club, the next adventure of the night, Blue Eyes motioned me to lean down and speak with him. He had something in his hand. As he slipped it into my palm, he told me he'd had a great night and would love to see me again. No pressure, just that it was nice to see a friendly face. I pulled back and smiled, as did he, and that was it. He didn't try to cop a feel or pull me down with him, both of which unfortunately has happened. He just slid out from the table's booth seating, gave me another smile, and followed his friends out of the club. When I checked my palm, he'd slipped me not a tip. Money would have tainted his invitation, made it sordid, but a business card. On the front was his name and his business, sales. On the back, his number with a smiley face. This felt like such a green flag. He'd handed me his whole name, allowing me to search him up online at my leisure. A business card, not a crumpled napkin, meant I could too look up his work. And the cell phone on the back wasn't printed on his card. He'd given me a direct line. Even the little smiley face felt like a good sign. No hearts, no obscene offer, just a perfectly friendly little smile. I sat on his offer for a week. I was seeing whether or not my lack of response would spur some hidden motive, or a return visit with more pressure. It didn't. He didn't return that week, not even the following Friday. He had truly left the ball in my court. After I stalked him a little on his social media, found out he had no wife, no girlfriend, just pictures of food and travel with a few group selfies with his friends, I decided, what the hell? I called him. Our first date was in a very chic little restaurant. I was making great tips at the bottle service gig, don't get me wrong, but even I was a little taken aback at the menu. There were no prices. That's a gamble that could cost hundreds, if not thousands. I offered to go Dutch. I didn't want him to get the wrong idea about me, but he reminded me he'd picked the restaurant and told me to relax. We ordered, and the food was great. So was the conversation. He was a very attentive listener. In fact, he asked me more questions than anyone ever had, about my childhood in Iowa, how I'd made it to Chicago, how I was saving up to open my own venture. I was immediately at ease with Winston, and at the end of the date he escorted me out to a waiting Uber X. I shivered a bit. The weather was in that weird state where it couldn't make up its mind to be hot or cold, and he immediately offered me his sweater, telling me it gave him a chance to see me again. One kiss outside the waiting car, and he sent me off with another charming smile. The next day when I went into work, my shift supervisor pulled me aside. With a small smile, she handed me a bouquet of roses, at least 3 dozen in pure white. When had I told him those were my favorite? I took them and smiled, breathing in the light perfume of the flowers. It was not a scent you'd generally encounter in a cologne and liquor-drenched place like this club. She asked me who they were from, and I showed her the card. She asked if he was a high roller. I answered that I'd met him at work, but he wasn't one of our VIPs, just a friend of one. I could read her skepticism, so I hastened to tell her he didn't know where I lived. It made sense he'd send them here, and it was just a nice dinner, nothing more. She seemed satisfied, but her tone gave me the same advice that she always did. The guys we met in clubs with their wallets on display didn't always have chaste kisses and simple dinners on the menu. I texted Winston a thank you and got back something sweet. Again, no pressure, just a glad you like 'em. No biggie, right? But the presents kept coming and escalating. The next day, it was a box from a designer store holding a truly luxurious fur-lined coat. The next day after, earrings, opal, another detail I didn't remember telling him. The day after that, a bangle bracelet with detailed filigree in white gold. On a hunch, I checked my social media. As it happened, I had posted a bouquet of white roses I got from high school graduation, and another post about my grandma's opal ring, opal and white gold, so that made some sense. He was checking my social media. I sat back, feeling a little off though. I mean, I'd absolutely checked his, but he was going back years in my posts to dig some of this stuff up, and the price tags were starting to add up, and the gifts kept arriving at my work, meaning my shift supervisor's increasingly tight expressions were weighing in. I looked up the restaurant we'd gone to online, and from reviews I figured out that our meal had to have been at least a couple hundred with the bottles of wine he'd ordered. The roses? Another couple hundred for 3 dozen on most florist sites with next day delivery. The coat? A cool grand. The jewelry? Also way too much for a one-date relationship. He wasn't pushy or asking for more, but the cost of things, so quick and so much, gave me a very weird feeling about the whole thing. In fact, it was so weird, it made me call Winston and sort of let him know it was too much. He didn't need to do any of that. But I only got to the part of thanking him for the gifts before he cut me off. He wanted to ask me to attend a party that weekend. Some swanky soiree out in a very moneyed area of town. I sort of waffled, then pushed on with telling him the gifts were too much. And then his tone changed. He immediately asked if I didn't like them, if he could get me something else. His tone was brisk, businesslike. I could picture him closing a sales deal. I was flummoxed. I tried to lighten my tone and joke about it, that he was making the other girls at work jealous. He relaxed a bit, responding I should let them be jealous, how they should see how valuable I was, and how well I should be treated. With his tone returning to that light, losing that edge, I was already nervous to tell him to stop with the gifts or even offer to return them, because what if he thought I was being ungrateful? So I decided to say yes to going to the party with him. He insisted on sending a car this time, and so caught up in so many thoughts, I said yes to this as well. He sounded like his normal, fun self again, and as we said goodbye, with him slipping in a few more compliments, how much he looked forward to having me on his arm in front of all of his friends, we both clicked end call. The next morning, I opened my front door to go out and grab a bagel and coffee, and I nearly punted a box sat in front of my apartment door. It was gift wrapped, and again, it was from a luxury boutique. I brought it inside, my nerves on edge. Inside I found a set of champagne and chocolate truffles and another piece of jewelry, a necklace set in dazzling blue topaz. What else was in the box? A note from Winston, telling me how much he looked forward to seeing me at the party that weekend. It was romantic and beautiful, and again, he had sent me my favorites. I should have been delighted, but instead I felt pinpricks of something unpleasant. Nerves. Because not only how had he purchased these things between our phone conversation and this morning, but second, how had he delivered it to my door? I thought back to our conversation the night before, and that's when I realized he now had another piece of information about me, the pickup address for the Uber. He knew my building and what number apartment for the driver to buzz. I picked up the little box of truffles and saw underneath it someone had left the receipt. When I saw the price tag for the chocolates and jewelry, my blood simmered in irritation. It was $2,000 and change. I'd told him the gifts were too much, and he'd gone out and doubled it. Well, that did it. I gathered up all the jewelry, the coat, and his sweater, and I put them into a tote bag. I was bringing it with me to the party, and at some point, I'd give them back to him in person. That way, he could see more of my body language and figure out that I was truly thankful, but I just felt weird about it. Hopefully, seeing me in the flesh would help him take me a little more seriously. And I'd show him two could play the disregard but the other wants game. The night of the party, I called and canceled the Uber. He'd ordered another Uber X, of course, another detail that added an easy $100+ to this insane tab he was spending on me. I got the address of the party from Uber, and I set out in my own car, driving in twilight, with some appropriately girl power punk on the stereo to bolster my resolve. He hadn't done anything outright wrong, aside from take my concerns and promptly ignore them, but I was nonetheless preparing for what might be an unpleasant conversation. Well, at least there'd be people nearby if it got ugly. By the time I made it to the gated community of the house where the soiree was being held, it had gone full night. The overcast clouds weren't raining yet, but they'd begun to mist. It added a fine layer of fog to swirl around the guard shack, the gates, and the houses and mailbox I passed once allowed in. I was driving slow. I turned down my radio to read the street signs and house numbers in the increasing fog, when I made a turn and saw a pair of headlights flash on. Through the fog, they became an almost blinding wall of light. I slammed on the brakes, hydroplaning a little, then sat completely still when I made out another light coming from the car ahead of me. As my eyes adjusted, I could read that the car was pulled long ways across the street, a one-car blockade, and from the center, where I surmised the dash was, pulsed a blue light. A knock at my window and I jumped. I'd been so fixated on the light of what appeared to be a cop car, an unmarked one with a dash light, that I hadn't noticed the man emerge from the white fog and make it all the way to my driver's side window. He, too, held a light, and it dazzled my already blown-out vision. I could only make out the outline of the man, and I could see he had long, light-colored hair pulled back in a ponytail that erupted in waves and curls. I reached for my purse to grab out my license as I rolled down the window a bit, but the man instead asked where I was heading. I I felt my license in my purse and pulled it out, then told him the address of the party. "Who invited you?" Odd question, but I figured, well, maybe this was additional security, and I wasn't recognized as anyone important. The man's face was still obscured by the light, but my vision was getting better again, more used to it. I started to make out the edge of his jaw, his profile when he turned to look in the direction beyond his car, up a hill to another cluster of lights that were, I guessed, the house where the party was being held. As he turned, I said Winston's name. For 1 second, I caught a tick in his jaw. Then his head whipped back to me with a quick, "No." What? I thought. Had he just told me no? To Winston inviting me, or... I tried to ask, but the man continued. His voice was low, and with the wind and falling patter of rain, I was surprised I could hear it, but it was clear. He said, "You can't be here. Turn around and go home." Confused, I interrupted. What? Why? But he only repeated, "You can't be here." I was shaken and only stared into where I thought his eyes might be. He still hadn't lowered his flashlight, and I was only getting bits and pieces of his face. He sighed, then added, "Something's going on down there. You're not safe there." This answer only gave me more questions I sputtered out, completely floored. I finally asked, Wait, you're police. It's some kind of bust?" I switched my license to my left hand and began to reach for my phone. It was fixed to my dash to help me navigate to the party. "Don't!" His voice was still low and wasn't angry, but it was clear and directive. I froze. He sighed again, then lowered his flashlight for 1 moment as he stared hard back up the hill. In that moment, I saw his face clearly, the fine mist and ambient light from our headlights illuminating him in a halo of glow. His long nose was aquiline, his jaw defined, and his face, while having the proportions of a full-grown adult, had no laugh lines, no crow's feet. Then the light was back up, and his tone casual, low and quiet. "Don't call him. Go home." But he's expecting me. A thought occurred. Wait, is he part of it? The bust? The man hadn't confirmed it was a bust, but what else could this be? I could no longer see his face, but I sensed a small smile when he responded. It'll be peanuts compared to what he's not expecting. I shivered. Something about that concealed mirth was alarming me, sending my pulse slamming into a tempo of a chant. Get out, get out, get out. The man seemed to sense my mood shift and leaned forward, allowing me one more peek at his face, at his eyes. If I'd thought Winston had blue eyes, I must have been blind. This man's eyes were ice chip blue, impossible blue, almost appearing to glow. Those eyes pierced me, and I heard my voice saying, "He knows where I live." Another beat. The man's voice washed over me. "It won't matter much longer. Go, Rebecca. Now." The flashlight bore directly into my eyes, and I squinted them shut. Flashing beats of light. I opened my eyes. I was in the parking garage of my apartment. My hands were cramped, holding the steering wheel in a death grip. I had the strangest thought that I'd imagined it all, that I had disassociated, maybe just sat here daydreaming and had never left at all. But something was in my hand, digging into my palm with its thin plastic edge. I opened my hand and looked. At once, I began to shake, dropping my license to my lap. It was real. All of it. I called out sick the whole next week. Every buzz from my phone sent chills through me. Would it be Winston? Would he be angry I no-showed? Would he somehow suspect I knew about the bust? Was it a bust? Or a sting? What do they call those? I stayed away from work, fearing he'd show up. I called in some of my friends to confirm no gifts were showing up, And they weren't. The honeyed too bad doll, you let a good catch off the hook. Jealousy of them didn't affect me. My stomach was clenched like a fist too tightly for their passive snideness to land. But as the week passed and nothing showed, not on his social media, no more gifts to the club, no texts or phone calls, no packages at my door, that fist began to loosen. I returned to work. After a few shifts of not seeing him, nor his friends, I began to chalk it all up to just a random thing. One of those big city stories you hear about. For whatever reason, I was unscathed, and Winston never called again, never showed up. I never saw his face again. Well, not until about a month later. I was getting ready for work. I had some sitcom on in the background for company. The sitcom ended and the 5 o'clock news came on. As I walked through the living room to fetch my top from the laundry basket, I saw Winston's face light up the screen. The top dropped from my hands. I turned and stared. The face was hardened into a sneer, an expression I'd never seen. But thinking back to that edge in his voice when I'd asked him to cool it with the gifts, I had a suspicion I'd heard. The pleasant newscaster answered the questions the man with the flashlight hadn't, as more pictures were shown, other men who'd been involved. The party had been busted up with a covert task force with the mission of stopping human trafficking. Some of the other guests, all girls, had been found passed out in a couple of rooms of the rented mansion. They'd been drugged. A couple had already been secured with zip ties, moved to one of a few vans outside, white panel vans with fake caterer business names printed on their sides. As I watched in horror, no longer caring about being late for work, about making rent, about anything other than this newscaster lady dropping ice cubes down my bloodstream with each discovery, another picture flashed on the screen, that of the lead investigator giving a press conference. Behind him stood his team, all grim, all proud. But as much as I looked, those piercing blue ice chip eyes, that long honey-colored hair, they were nowhere to be found. I live now knowing that even a guy who seems like a green flag can be anything but. The presents, costly, were a lure to ensure I came along, even out of guilt for how much he was splashing out on me, and what they'd purchased so cheaply. He'd confirmed that I lived alone, with family states away, all in one dinner. An offer of a car to bring me to a party gave him my address. I've since stopped torturing myself with questions. What if I'd left earlier? What if I'd taken the Uber instead? What other signs did I miss? It all drove me nuts, so I finally just quit them, and my job, finding resolution in a boring office job typing endless memos. All questions dropped. Well, almost all. Because who was that man who stopped me that night, neither identified as cop or part of the ring? Why did he send me away when I could have been one more witness, one more piece of evidence in a covert operation like this? Why did he save me? How did I get home? And how, without ever seeing my license, did he know my name? That's story 182, another for the books. Or book, which is still coming out in October, pending some miraculous thing like a publisher wanting it. I'd say it's unlikely, but given this channel and the kind of stories I tell here, well, far be it from me to say anything is impossible. If you have a story you'd like to share, email and social are in the description. Liking, commenting, and subscribing does something to the algorithm that I think it likes. But I'm just really happy that you tuned in today to listen. And if you tune in next week, we can do it all over again. So until then, take care, strangers.